Hey, what's up guys? Today we're gonna talk about how you can combine a NestJS application with ReactJS application into a single monorepo. Imagine that. We are gonna try to create a full stack application. JavaScript to TypeScript, both on the front end and back end, combining this solution in the same repo. You know, we love React, and we wanted to use React.js on the front end. Now, most people that have this use case probably should just consider Next.js, right? Yes, which is a pretty good solution, believe me. Next.js is a framework for React, and it also serves as basically somewhat of a backend framework that allows you to do, your own API routers. But that is not the end. You can do server-side rendering, static site generation with Next.js, which is pretty cool when you want a website focused on SEO. But one thing to think about though is if perhaps you don't need to server-side rendering or static site generation. Mm, you probably could just get away with doing a single page application, right? Using React.js, for example. But that is a chapter that we're going to discuss in another video. That being said, let's focus on our solution, which is basically React.js on its own, and then just have your NestJS application server as an API that up in production. And this is exactly the use case that we are going to cover in this video. So how do we create a monorepo that has both of these things together, the API and the front end? We can build our entire project, as you know, one running server that effectively has both of these things. So I've got a terminal here open. You can see that I'm using Node.js and npm 9. So I've got a terminal here opened. You can see that I'm using Node 18 and npm 9. Let's have a look. Can you see? Node version 18 and npm-v. We can see here I'm using npm version 9, right? So you do need to use one of the newer versions of npm that supports workspace, which we are need for our monorepo. So let's start and create our directory for this application. I just called my project as dashboard. Have a look at this. So now go into that folder and immediately you are going to get installed the dependencies. So first, we have to create our package.json file. So I'm going to do here npm init to create this application for us. So version, all of these configurations here, I won't fill out just for this purpose. And then now we can have a look inside this project, right? So if we do like this, we can see we have the package.json file already. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna install Turbo. So install -d Turbo. So now here is our application. Let's check inside the Visual Studio Code. So I'm gonna do code dot open the Visual Studio Code. So now we have our Visual Studio Code up and running, and now we are going to add something here in the package.json file, which is workspace, which takes an array, and you can pass in here a path of a pattern where all your workspaces will be. So let's have a look on the package.json file. We can see we already have the turbo reference here, and now what I'm doing now is to add a workspace parameter. Sorry, like this, right? So on the left side here, I'm going to go ahead and create that new apps folder. So let's create the folder here now. Apps, as I mentioned in the package.json file. And I'm back in the terminal here to start creating those new applications. If you're not familiar with Nest, it does come with a CLI that you need to install globally. So if you haven't done that before, the npm install-g at nestjs/cli at latest will install the Nest CLI for us. So let's do this. npm install-g nestjs-cli at latest, and there you go. Let's install Nest. Then I have the package installed right now. So once you have that installed, we are going to go to the apps folder. So let me enter in this folder, cd apps, and then we will use the CLI to install a new project. We are going to install the Nest API first. So we can use the Nest CLI command like nest new API. We are going to call this project as API. It's not an issue. So let's start to creating this one. We can select the package we are going to configure our project. I'm going to select an npm. Have to wait a little bit. And NestJS will install already all the packages for us. And there you go. Now NestJS finished the installation for us, and we can see in the left here in our project, in our application, it has been created for us. So we can see here the API already here, right? We are going back now to this code in a few seconds, but first, let's also create our client application while we are in the terminal. Now, for the React application that we are going to use. So for that, guys, so in order to create this new application, we can just do npm create vite latest client. We're going to call this app client, okay? Just to keep the separation between API and client more clearly. So let's start creating this. Yes. We are going to use React, as I said. We're going to use TypeScript for this project, and that's it. Now we can see on the left here, we have both applications, API and the client ready. Now, one thing that we have to pay attention now is that we are going to do npm install at the root of the project. You might be wondering, why didn't I do that in the client folder or in the API? Well, Nest already installed all the dependencies for the API, but not for the client, right? Well, the way that workspaces work, we have to do that in the root folder. So is that basically it will look at all the individual packages, .json files, right? Both in API folder and also in the client folder. There is a package.json in there. So even if you install at the root, and really you should be installed at the root, it should resolve your dependencies correctly for every folder. All right, so at this point, we've got two applications. We've got a NestJS API application and a React client. But let's do the npm install first. So I am in the root folder. I have the package.json file here. Let's do npm install. So there you go. We have both applications up to date. Now we need to start thinking about how do we work with both of these applications at the same time. Right. So for this example, when you are developing locally, it would be great if both of them are running at the same time, or perhaps at deploy time, you want to be able to build both of these at the same time, right? So that is where Turborepo comes in. It's a tool that helps you basically get a monorepo up and running very fast to get all things together started. So we are going to create a new file at the root. We are going to call this file as turbo.json. And I'm going to do some initial config here that you can feel free to pause the video and screen or copy this configuration. So let me start creating this new file here, turbo.json. There you go. And now I'm going to create this new configuration. I have to do schema, HTTPS. Let's see, turborepo.org, schema.json. Then pipeline, pipeline dev, and cache. Oops. For cache, we are going to use false, right? Now, you don't have to fully understand how Turborepo works just to get started with this solution, right? It can be pretty simple, but you can hover over some of these things here, the configuration, and have a quick look on what we are doing here. So for example, if we hover over the pipeline, we can see it's an object representing the task dependency graph of your project. And Turbo interprets these conventions to schedule, execute, and cache the outputs of tasks in your project. And in case of dev, for example, the name of a task that can be executed by Turbo. If Turbo finds a workspace package with a package.json scripts object with a machine key, it will apply the pipeline task configuration to that npm script during execution. So that's exactly what we want, right? It's basically gonna run that project across your different applications. So when we do the turbo configuration, we are going to call the starting point for API and client together. So what that means is now in our client configuration, we are going to the package.json in our client. You can run our application using npm run dev like this, right? If we look at this, we can do npm run dev and we will start the client application. Let's take a look at the API now. So the API JSON, the package JSON file that has our script, we also have start dev here, right? So what we're gonna do here, keep like this, as we have in the dev in the client application. We are going to simplify this to just be dev. So that is a matching with the client and API project. Now, while we are here, I'm actually gonna add a flag here to present our output logs. So let's add this flag here. We can do dash dash preserve watch output, which basically says that as we change the code, don't clear out the terminal. Right. So at this point, we have a npm script dev for both API and client ready. And in Turborepo, we said that we have this task here called dev, like this, right? So for us to run this task, we are also going to add a script in the root package JSON. And I will also just call this dev to be consistent. And we are gonna do turbo run dev like this. So we have the script here ready, right? But I'm gonna remove it from here and I will add it here. And instead of test here, I don't need this anymore. I'm gonna do dev and add the turbo configuration here. So turbo run dev. Now we are ready. Let's go ahead and go to our terminal and run and play and run dev and see what happened. So let's check the terminal. npm run dev. So now, as we can see, we ran turbo run dev command, which says that it is going to this configuration that we had, and it says we have a task called dev for both applications. And what that's gonna do is go into the individual applications, API and client that we have, and look at their package.json files and run the dev command for each one of them because it matches the same key that we have here in Turbo. Right. So you can see now that both of our applications are running. We can check this real quick like this. So we can open the local host here and we can see is running. And as usual, the API project is running using the port 3000, like this. We can see here, yes, yeah, it's returning hello world. Now, it's important to quickly explain how our local development setup differs from our production setup when we actually deploy our application together. So what we effectively have is two different servers running side by side, right? And then for the client side, we have an application serving up our React application, and both of these guys are waiting for code change and will automatically refresh the application. So let's take a look on this solution. We have our development environment. Usually, when we are looking at our development environment, we can have two different apps, two different servers running. One for the front end here and another one for the API. However, in our production environment, that is not how it works, right? We will have a single server for both. So imagine that we will have a build for our Nest application and we will have a build for our React application. And we can think about that. The build of our Nest application is just something that you can run via Node, right? It doesn't need a Webpack for this application. It just runs a node, and one of the abilities that we are going to add to it is that it's going to be able to serve up the client build to a browser. And similarly, we have an API that effectively is coming with our next application. So let's think about that. We have production environment here, right? And we have our application here, the API. And our React application as well, right? And this is the browser, the client side. So let's put here together. So what happened here is the browser will call the API. The API will return to the React application, and the React application will display into the browser. Well, I'm oversimplifying it a little bit, but that effectively is going to be the end result that we are going to have in the end of this video. Now, quickly, we need to talk about in local development, if we have two separate servers. How do you proxy requests from the client to the server side? For example, if there is a running server here and the client makes a request to /API, for example, how does it know to forward that to our next application if they are running into different servers? Now, luckily, this is actually something that it directly supports. So let's go ahead and configure that, and let's take a look at our vite.config.ts to the one under apps client, and we are just gonna add some server configuration in here. Let's have a look on this. In our Vite application, yeah, we have the vite.config.ts. What we have to do here is to create our server configuration. So let's do that server, and proxy. We're gonna call this slash API. We're gonna create a target for that. TTP as our local host 3000 and change origin true. That said, proxy, if you see this path of slash API, for example, when receive a request from the browser, make sure to proxy that to the localhost 3000, which is our local Nest application, right? Now, that does mean that every request that we are trying to make to our Nest app has to have this base slash API. So I'm also going to configure our Nest API to have that base path of slash API for all of its routers. So to do that, in main.ts, I just need to add app that set global prefix API. So let's have a look. Now, if you are getting a little lost on what I'm trying to do here, go ahead and run your application. And let's do a quick demo previously on localhost 3000. Let me stop the application here. I'm gonna run again this application. Right. So now, as you can see, we have our front-end application running, right? And what we are gonna do is have a look on the API side. What happened? It's not found anymore. All right. Why that is happening? It's because we have changed and redirected for this address. So we have to go to slash API on localhost 3000 to get back that response. Okay, so what we have to do right now? Now, what we are gonna do on the React application is we are gonna do a request that slash API so that we get back the hello world greeting. All right, so this time let's move over to client-side React application. Let's go to the app.tsx file, which is showing that thing you see in the browser earlier with the React and logo. Let's have a look. What I'm gonna do here is just clean this up and remove these things here. We are gonna display our greeting here. So let's change something. I'm gonna remove all the things here and do a H1 and put a greeting here. So imagine that we have a greeting state. Let's go ahead and update this. So what I'm gonna do here is to change the greeting here and use state like this, right? And we have to use a use effect as well to make sure we are gonna update that value once we get this, right? So I'm gonna call the API here oops, slash API, as we mentioned previously, and then get the response here as a text, right? And then we are gonna set this value to our state, like this. So that is going to make a call to slash API, which we said is gonna proxy to our Nest API, right? And then we are just gonna get the text from the endpoint, then set the greeting from the response. So we expect to have a hello world come back from our API, right? So what effectively is going to happen when this application is mounted? Right. It is going to make a call to slash API, and then it's gonna get a greeting. It's gonna save the reading and it's going to display it over here. So let's take a look. We have this here, and oh, look at this. We already have the hello world pop up in our page, right? So now at this point, if you are following along, your React application also should be saying hello world in the front page, right? And remember, that is coming straight from our Nest API. So we know that the proxy is happening now in production. It doesn't need to do any proxy because it is just making the request directly to the same server. So you don't have to worry about it. And this is really just a proxy for local development, right? So at this point, imagine, you are done with your development. Maybe you are ready to deploy a new feature. We need to think about how do we build both of our applications together. And similarly to how we ran both of our applications together for dev, you can also build both of your application in the same time. So in our turbo.json file, and you have the turbo.json file here, we are going to add a build key here in our pipeline, and similarly kind of like how we have a npm script dev for both of our applications. We already should have a build npm script for API. If you look at the API package.json file, there should already be a build script here, like this. Let me show you. If we look at the package.json file, we have a build configuration here. And if you look in your client package.json file, there should also be a build here. Let's have a look as well. You can see we have the build here as well. So now we do have to add a couple extra pieces of configuration here. We are gonna add depends on. Let's open the turbo script. So we have the dev pipeline here. I'm gonna add build straight away here, and we should add depends on like this build. And also we're gonna add output, right? Dist dash like this. And the output is pretty simple. Basically, when both of our applications builds, there is gonna be a dist directory and both of those applications. So this is actually a relative path to each of our applications. So when you build the Nest and when you build the React application, they both have a dist folder in there. So we are just letting Turborepo know where that is, and it depends on, it's basically just a, you know, it's started to build a dependency graph. When you do npm run build, what does this depend on? You know, you can list other things in here. For example, perhaps you have your build depending on tests or linting, right? If you have an npm script set up for those, it's basically going to run those things before it runs the build in our case here. And if you hover over this, it will say that the symbol tells Turbo that this pipeline task depends on the packages, you know, upstream dependencies, like this. Can you see? So basically, it says that it needs to build the dependencies and make sure those builds for those things are built before building the application itself. I know that's super kind of complicated. Hmm. There are some extra documentation on this in the Turbo site itself if you want to read about it. But for now, feel free to just follow along. This is really the only configuration you need. And if you need more knowledge or if you want to go deep on this configuration, you can go in the Turbo website and have a look. All right. So for us to test this configuration, this task, if you remember in the root package.json, we added a dev script that they basically invoke that task. We are going to do the same thing here for the build one. We are going to add a build and do turbo run build. And we can run this on the terminal to test this. Let's create this configuration here. Build and add turbo run build here. Now let's go to the terminal and have a look and run npm run build. But before that, let me stop our application here. Now I'm gonna do npm run build. Let's have a look on what happened. What this is going to do is basically call npm run build in all over applications. So in our client and API, we can see that it actually will try to build both of them in parallel. And then we didn't talk about this yet, but you can see that there is some caching happening here. Can you see here? Take a look at what happened when I run build again. It will say that it's already cached. Let's have a look. One cached. Let's try again. Oh, it doesn't have to rebuild everything. Can you see that? We can see here we have this message 30 milliseconds full turbo. So it just did in 30 milliseconds. It will know that if the code didn't change, it will just reuse the build that it made for you before. And that's also why for our dev scripts, and that is also why for our dev scripts we said cache false, because it doesn't really provide us any benefit, because we know that the build for dev is going to change often, right? Because we are changing the code. So caching doesn't really make sense there, but for build, it does. And if you just want to prove that both of our applications built right, if you go on apps, you should expect to see a dist folder within API right here. And there should also be a dist folder with client. Let's have a look as well. If we go here into the API, we can see the dist folder. And in the client also, we have the dist folder here. And that's why we said that the output is in this. And that's some part of the way that the caching works is it looks at the output of those to reuse what we built before. Right. So at this point, we know how to create our builds. We know we can do it in parallel with a single command. There is one missing piece here that we have to remember. We have these separated builds from the React and the application, but we said that in production, the Nest application is going to serve up our client build to the browser. That way, we still only have one single server running in production. Now, if you don't know how to do that, luckily, this solution can support for serving up a static single-page application using the service static module that we just need to install that as a new package to our application. And then, after that, just a little bit of configuration and we'll be done. So, back in our application to install a new package. So remember that, we have the apps folder and each of these apps have their own package.json. You might think that you have to go to each of these folders and run the npm install in there, which you don't with workspaces. You can just do npm install dash workspace and then define the name of the workspace. In our case, we are trying to install inside API the NestJS server static package. So let's go into the root folder. Let's call this command npm install dash dash workspace API at NestJS serve static. There you go. Now we are gonna go to our app.modules.ts in the API and we are gonna add to the imports here. So let's have a look. First of all, in the API here, I have to go into the apps.modules.ts file and let's add the imports. Server static module .for root open curly braces root path join. We have to import the join as well here. Underline their name. Let's add the path in here. Oops. Open quote client and dist. So we added the server static module for root. And then we are going to pass in the path to our client build, right? And also make sure to import that new substatic modules. But this path, if you can think about it, is basically, going back twice. So that is goes back to apps, and then into client, and then into this where it's gonna find this index, right? So at this point, all we need to do is build the application again, and then start our API basically in production mode. And if you look at the package.json for API, you can see that they have a start.prod script here that basically just does, node run the application on this main. We are just going to emulate that on the route. So on the root package.json, I'm just going to add a start script here that does node apps API package.json, and I'm going to add start node apps API dist main. In this main, right? So that is basically the same thing except it's coming from the root. And then at this point, I think we are basically done with the code. We can go ahead and do npm run build to make sure, it pulls in those changes that we just did with server static, and then we should be able to do npm start, which is going to spin up our Nest API server in production mode, and then serve our client product or our client app just built, which is going to spin up our Nest API server in production mode, and then serve our client build. Right. So you can see our application successfully started. Let's have a look. npm start. Right. So as you can see, our application successfully started. Have a look. Oops. Let me copy that. Yeah, it started. And going back to localhost 3000, which is technically our Nest application, right? But the Nest application right now is serving the React application as well. So as you can see, that is now serving up our React static application built from the API. And we can see that it is still displaying the hello world because it's making that call to serve itself. And there bring us back that hello world response. And there you go. We've got an end-to-end full stack setup for React and API. All right, guys. Hopefully that quick tutorial was very useful to you. Let me know in the comments what you think. Would you do in this way? Would you do in another way? I'd love to know what kind of feedback you have also do. Make sure to subscribe this channel if you like content like this. I have a lot more planned this year, so make sure to subscribe and tap the bell icon to get notified. And I will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.